Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Good evening from North Kensington in the shadow of Grenfell Tower at the start of our Housing Britain Week. Tonight we ask, what should be the future of social housing in the light of the Grenfell tragedy? What's it like to live in social housing in 2017? The Grenfell survivors and local residents speak of endlessly being ignored by the authorities, treated as second-class citizens. How can that change? How many new social homes should be built? Who should build them? None of these questions were really at the forefront of the national debate before at least 80 people died in the fire on the 14th of June. Today, the fallout continues. 2-year-old Jeremiah Dean was today identified as having died in Grenfell along with his mother. In a statement, his family said, "You spent a moment in our arms, but you will last a lifetime in our hearts." And the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford announced that a trauma unit affecting 52 inpatient beds would close for up to a year because of concerns over the cladding and other fire safety issues. The beds will be moved to other wards within the hospital. Well, here in Kensington and Chelsea, a new chief executive was also announced for the tenant management organisation that runs all the social housing, including Grenfell Tower in this borough. But as we begin our Housing Britain series, we look at what it's like to live in social housing in one of the richest boroughs in the country and find a borough divided by more than the line between north and south. It was one appalling and extraordinary tragedy contained in one London tower block. But the fire at Grenfell has exposed a crisis in housing across the capital and beyond. Gemini was born a few streets away from Grenfell. She devotes her time to campaigning for better social housing in the estates around the tower from her own 2-bedroomed housing association flat nearby. She shares it with her husband and 2 children, aged 17 and 15.
I'm not on the waiting list. There's very little point on being on the waiting list. It's incredibly unlikely. My best bet is home swapper. I mean, really, we're overcrowded, but there are so many more people in much more overcrowded situations that have been on lists for years and have no hope of moving.
Gemini's right. The current waiting time for social housing in the borough is at least 5 years, and that's if you're high priority. In 2014, the council controversially took a guillotine to their housing list. At that point, just under 8,000 households were on it. The council cut it back to around 2,700, leaving, it said, those households most in need. Last year, the council had just 433 properties available to those on the waiting list, mainly studios or 1-bedroom flats. The council argue that in a borough with such a limited supply of social housing, there's no point leaving people with little or no priority waiting for a home they'll never get. It's fairer to keep them off the list. But some residents read it very differently.
I think it's just a really clear message that they don't want people on who need social rents in here, in this borough. You know, they plan to regenerate the whole borough, and it's not the people that they want.
It was a similar refrain in the days after the fire. Survivors told of the many complaints which had been made over the years by residents about the state of the tower and over fire safety. Complaints which weren't listened to by the council or the tenant management organisation. Eve Allison is a Conservative councillor and lives in social housing. She says even she struggles to get her voice heard.
I think certain sections of society, definitely we are left in crisis mode, and we're left until when a crisis happens, which was the Grenfell fire, for people to be listened to and for the whole fissure of the whole of the problems, the whole of the culture to actually be cracked open. It shouldn't have to take a fire for that to happen.
Linda Wade is one of just 2 Liberal Democrat councillors on the Conservative-run council. In her view, social housing simply hasn't been enough of a priority.
I think it's been slightly put to one side. I think it's been undervalued, and I think been underinvestment. And I think that over the last, if one had a strategy in place, say a 10-year strategy in place, to actually upgrade all of the facilities within property, you would not only retain social affordable housing, but you would probably have an opportunity to construct more.
The council's immediate priority is, of course, to rehouse the Grenfell survivors. They say they've invested in around 100 properties across the borough, including more than 60 units in this new block in Kensington, alongside existing social homes, to help house people affected by the fire. In the long run, though, this council, like so many others, has a much tougher problem to solve. Not just how it closes the gap between the supply and demand for social housing, but how it makes people who live in it feel equal to those who own their own homes. Well, so many issues to discuss. We did ask Kensington and Chelsea Council and the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, as well as the government, to come on, but no one was available. Samia Badani, you're the chair of Bramley Residents Association, around here, a few streets away. You heard what some of the tenants said in that piece. Does that chime with what residents tell you?
Well, I'm not surprised. I'm just depressed that this is happening, across the board for social housing tenants. I think it's quite difficult. What we have here in Kensington and Chelsea is a tenant management organisation that's lost its tea. It's not resident-led. Its purpose is to represent their own interests. So often we are ignored, and I'll give you a very specific example. A few years ago, we had no water supply in Bramley House, and it lasted 3 days. And we had to be on the phone, explain to them that it's an emergency, and we're completely ignored. So this is really what's happening across the borough here.
Melvin Akins, you grew up in one of the so-called finger blocks that spring out from the bottom of Grenfell Tower. You're still in social housing nearby. Do you recognise that?
Yeah, absolutely. Since the inception of the Tenant Management Organisation in 1995, they have consistently not listened to residents. I've grown up with that experience. I continue to experience that on a daily basis. And whenever they consult residents on what action to take, quite often they've made the decisions already and use that as a paper exercise to say that they've actually consulted residents.
Why do you think that happens? A tenant management organisation, you say, that's lost the tea for tenants. Why has that happened?
I think it boils down to what they perceive as being too much for the people in those properties. I think the managers of those organisations have a limit to how much the people in social housing are entitled to, and we see that in terms of representation, in terms of how much is actually spent on the appropriate cladding.
So they don't deserve more, in your view?
That's the only conclusion I can come to. I've seen that the amount of money that is being generated from rent is about 17 million. 75% of that money is actually going on staff salaries rather than reinvested into housing stock. Now that cannot be right.
I mean, Emma Dent-Coad, you're now the new Labour MP, but you've been on the council for years, and you were on the Tenant Management Organisation for a number of years too. Do you feel embarrassed or ashamed by what these residents say?
Grief, no, not at all. On the Tenant Management board, it was very difficult to get any kind of results at all. Being a minority, there were two Conservative councillors, residents, two other outsiders, and then one Labour voice. And there's only ever been one Labour voice, and there's only one Labour voice now. So whatever you say, whatever you would get, I got shouted at a lot of meetings because I ask questions, and I've always done that. That's my job. As a councillor, I found the TMO very difficult to deal with. They don't answer your emails. You had to chase them up. They can be quite obnoxious sometimes.
But you're also a councillor.
Yeah,
so
well, exactly. So you would think that
were
they
you
would
not
listen.
able to do more from that point of view to get the residents' views heard?
Well, you have to keep on trying. You shouldn't have to ask 3 times for somebody's rights, actually. They do treat residents as a nuisance. And I've always said, but they work for you. Actually, the TMO works for you. It's not the other way around. And they're treated as a nuisance.
Tony Devonish, what do you make of that as a Conservative and Assembly member for this area? Residents ignored, not listened to, treated as a nuisance. It's shameful.
These are issues we have to get to the bottom of, absolutely. I'm sure these issues are across London as well. But let's, on a positive note, talk about the government's given £3 billion to actually build 90,000 more houses. And Mr Khan, the Mayor of London, has got that opportunity. He needs to get on with building those homes. OK,
that's good news, and we'd like to deal with that a little bit later on. But dealing with the specific complaints of people in the Grenfell Tower who predicted this catastrophe and yet still say they're not listened to, they're shown no respect. What's wrong that that's happened?
Well, absolutely, we need to get to the bottom of that, and that's what the public inquiry will be looking at, and all the other
Do you have any views on it?
Well, there's lots of views. I'm not here to just comment on particular, specific one-by-one views. I totally respect all the residents, and as a ward councillor of the neighbouring borough, I deal with these issues day in, day out as well. And we've got new leadership in the Royal Borough. Elizabeth Campbell is a dedicated public servant, and I'm sure she'll get to the bottom of it with officers. We have a team of officers now across London Government looking at this and making sure we improve, and we need to improve, absolutely, as Elizabeth and the government has said.
Samia Badani, are you confident?
Not at all. I think we're in a situation where a majority of us think that the TMO's position is no longer tenable. We've lost confidence in the TMO. It's beyond repair. I don't think you can improve the management by the TMO, and I think what we need now is an interim measure, because the TMO is still making decisions on our health and safety, and we have no confidence that our interests come first.
So it's the fact that the council and the TMO have promised, they've got new leadership, they've promised a new way of thinking.
And there's very little consultation into what actions they should take. You know, as Samia has said before, it's supposed to be a resident-led tenant management organisation, yet they don't consult the very people who they are there to serve and there to provide services for. And that just isn't acceptable, especially considering what's now happened. To continue to operate in the same vein just beggars belief.
Antonio Devonish, you know, I touched in the report there on this decision to sort of guillotine the housing list. Now, the council's argument is, you know, we simply don't have social housing. There's no point leaving people on a list for homes they'll never get. Do you understand why residents feel that is an attempt to squeeze social housing tenants out of this area?
I understand the reasoning, absolutely, but like, as I say, the real reason is got to build more homes. We all agree more homes have to be built. The government have given £3 billion for 90,000 homes. We've got to build the homes as quickly as possible, because you can't solve this on a borough-by-borough basis. There's 33 London boroughs. It's a national issue, and particularly a London issue.
And briefly, as residents, what do you hope will be the sort of legacy, positive legacy, if there can possibly be one, from this terrible tragedy?
Just equality. I think we can't live in a society where it's one rule or one outcome for one socio-economic class and another outcome for another. You know, if that had been a building of 129 leaseholder owners, I am absolutely certain that we wouldn't have had the outcome that we have, or the decisions that were made into the refurbishment of that building would have been different.
Samia, briefly?
Yeah, we want to move to a system where residents plan services and can plan policies rather than being allegedly consulted on.
OK, lots more to talk about, and we'll come back to you after this. But the big question is, does the welfare state still have an obligation to house everyone who can't afford to buy or rent their own home? How many social housing units should be built? Ever since Labour's Nye Bevin proposed council houses for everyone after the Second World War, the politics of social housing have been shifting. The most significant change, of course, was Margaret Thatcher allowing council tenants the right to buy. But since then, successive governments have not spent the money on building the equivalent volume of new council houses. We'll be debating the right direction for social housing in a minute. But first, here's Michael Crick with a look at how attitudes have changed to the buildings that still house 1 in 6 of us here in the UK.
We know now that we have built more than 300,000 houses, new houses, in 1953.
Conservative Housing Minister Harold Macmillan hits his target, opening the last council house built that year.
Mr. and Mrs. Poulton will be the tenants.
The Poultons were living with their parents before they got this home. Last week, 64 years on, we took Olive Poulton back.
Mr. and Mrs. Poulton will be the tenants.
And what was it like that day?
Exciting, really. I'm very pleased to get our own house.
And the Minister of Housing himself beckons them in to take possession.
At that time, all parties thought the state had a duty to house those in need. Their neighbours got their council home, though, after doing someone a favour.
I was in the Barnet Conservative Club again. He said, Bruce, and he handed me some keys. And he said, I want you to go and have a look at this property. And it was here, which is here now, 271 Maze Lane.
So you got the tenancy here,
Yeah.
you're doing a favour to a Conservative councillor?
Yes, but can you say that on television?
It was the return of men from the First World War that really obliged British local councils to house the poor, as in Becontree in Dagenham. This estate was soon the biggest housing scheme in the world.
What it was is homes for heroes, of course, after the war. People living in London lived in very substandard conditions, and I think the 1917 Russian Revolution has something to do with it as well.
Why?
Because I think the government were very perturbed about people possibly uprising against the government as they were in Russia.
So what, give them good houses, keep them quiet?
Keep them happy.
The local museum shows how in 15 years they built 25,000 homes over 4 square miles for 125,000 people, many brought here from the East End slums. Every house got a handbook with rules and advice.
Among the rules, they had to clean their windows once a week. And when it came to lavatory systems, they were told there is no need to pull the chain with a jerk.
And the streets and green spaces of this aspirational working class community nurtured a gallery of star names.
We like to say in Barking and Dagenham that we won the World Cup in 1966. The reason for that is Sir Alf Ramsey lived in Halbert Street, 10 minutes from here. Martin Peters lived in Ravens Road, just along from here, and Jimmy Greaves in Ivy House Road.
Post-war, though, the real trend was to replace slums and bond houses with high-density flats. Tower blocks soared, but few predicted the squalor of so-called sink estates, as I explored for Channel 4 News more than 30 years ago in Edinburgh.
Its graffiti-covered walls, its dark alleyways, its stinking staircases, today are monuments to the decline it's suffered since then.
Indeed, there are dozens of similar estates in inner cities around the country.
In the 70s, almost half the nation were council tenants. Then came Margaret Thatcher's monumental change, giving tenants the right to buy their homes at big discounts.
Don't you think this is lovely? And the trouble Mrs. Patterson's taken with it. And Mr. Patterson's a handyman. He's put in all these.
And when Olive Poulton and her husband bought their home, it was a symbolic moment.
Nice to go up in the world.
What do you mean by nice to go up in the world?
Well, you know, some people look down on you, you know. Oh, you live in a council house, and that's not good. But when you own your own property, you do go up in the world a little bit.
Their next-door neighbours, like most of this street, bought too, though they feel slightly misled.
You had a right to buy, but the money that was taken from what you bought with was going to build other houses, other council houses.
That's right, yeah.
Which never happened.
Labour's Nye Bevan wanted council houses for everyone, not just those in need.
The Minister pointed out the disadvantages of sharing homes.
That it's all right to have visits from your mother-in-law, but you don't want to live with her all the time.
More horrifying for Bevan still would have been the thought that these flats he once opened in Hammersmith might one day be sold. Just above Bevan's plaque, 70 years on, Maria Trinidad pays her private landlord £1,200 a month, more than twice what her council tenant neighbours pay. So she has to ask the state to help with her rent.
I have to rely on housing benefit, but housing benefit is a benefit which is difficult sometimes to get right. So what I usually do is that I use my bank overdraft in order to be able to cover my rent and my basic living expenses.
Can't you just go along to the council and ask to be put on the waiting list for your own council flat?
I won't be able to do that because I'm not considered to have a housing need because I currently live in a two-bedroom flat.
In my opinion, there were winners and losers from the right to buy. The winners were the people who bought at a substantial discount. That gave them the key to social mobility to move away or to leave an inheritance to their children. And ironically, the losers are probably the grandchildren of those people that bought in the early days. They won't have the same right as their grandparents did to get a council house. Half the housing stock has been sold now, so they'll never ever get the same opportunity as their grandparents.
Under Blair and Brown's New Labour, Tory governments too, the building of new council homes dwindled to almost nothing. And for 30 years, councils have been encouraged to transfer their stock, its maintenance and the building of new social housing to private non-profit housing associations. But now, in Becontree and other parts of Dagenham and Barking, the local council hopes to recreate the early spirit of the estate through its brand new Right to Invest scheme for its tenants. They can buy a share of their homes, as much as 70%, with the council keeping the rest.
When the Becontree was designed and developed, you could have a plumber, you could have a butcher, you could have a nurse, you could have a doctor, all living on the estate. What we need to do is not get hung up like the government has over home ownership. We need to be able to give people the right to rent. We need to give people the right to invest in their community, and we need to give people the right to move. And that's really, really changed over the last 40 years.
Okay, Mum. But obviously, there's a lot of memories here.
Olive Poulton and daughter Janice, who was born here, look back fondly on the house politicians provided them to rent, then buy.
Yes, it's emotional. We had many happy days here.
But should and could modern politicians give the same helping hand to today's young people that they had?
Michael Crick reporting there, where we're still joined by residents and politicians in the shadow of Grenfell Tower, with a lot to discuss about social housing. Tony Devonish, you know, in that film we heard what it used to mean, you know, homes for heroes after the war. We've heard people today say they don't really feel like heroes in social housing, the exact opposite. How can we fix that?
We need to build more homes is the easy answer. In London, we're trying to build 90,000 homes by 2022. The mayor has been given £3 billion by the government, and the mayor has to actually build those homes. It's that simple, more housing.
You see, you say it's that simple. We've heard endless politicians of both colours over the years saying, we're going to build more houses, we've got this great target, and somehow it doesn't seem to materialise.
Well, I think the government white paper really made a change, and the fact that the government's given so much money to local authorities across the country, and here in London it goes to the mayor, I think it can happen. But you're absolutely right, we need to get on with it. We need to have more builders, smaller builders getting involved. The public sector actually land bank an awful lot, parts of councils and TfL in London. We need to actually get that land out of the hands of civil servants and into builders to build it.
And what about allowing councils to borrow more money for building housing?
I'm broadly supportive of that, but I think we have to be careful if certain councils aren't particularly renowned for their financial prudence. But yes, certainly councils that actually are well run should get on building houses. Anna
Minton, you've written a lot about housing, big capital, what is London for, who is London for, your book. What is your thought about what Tony Devon
Well, I
says?
mean, you know, you only need to look around the London skyline, other views apart from this one, and there's construction going up all over London. We are building lots and lots of homes, but who are they for? You know, they're for billionaire investors, they're for, you know, offshore investors. They're not for Londoners, and they're certainly not affordable. And even the 25% affordable housing, which is included in those developments, that was actually redefined by the Conservatives to mean up to 80% of market value or market rent. So when you look at a two-bedroom apartment on one of these new developments, say Elephant Park, which replaced the Haygate estate in Elephant and Castle, that'll be between £750,000 to £1 million. The affordable component there is actually 80% of that. How is that affordable?
You can argue that, but I don't agree with you on your first point. It's only 3% of housing is what you call oligarch housing or similar. A lot of housing
Well,
is
if I just
affordable.
take you back to that development in Elephant and Castle.
That's one development.
Well, the whole first phase of Elephant Park has been sold to foreign investors, and there is actually a huge amount of that sort of thing going on, of flipping, where apartments are sold directly to Southeast Asia investor markets without even hitting London
What you're
markets.
missing, if I can say, is actually when you do sell to an overseas investor, there's still the Section 106 money, as you well know, and that goes to affordable housing. So if you build housing for all sorts of
which
people,
is 80% of market rent. I mean, how's that affordable?
all sorts of people, you will be able to actually get social housing as well.
Okay,
if you stop the market, you won't.
Just 1 second. Ilhan Yunus, you're 17 years old. You were brought up in social housing. What do you say to Tony Devonish?
Well, I agree with what Anna's saying about this, you know, new homes being built. They're not affordable. If you look at places like Westminster, the rent, £665. It's only when you get to up north, such as places like Nottingham, £110. It's like she said, who is London for? People like myself, after I leave university, am I expected to stay up north, or can I come back down here and buy a house?
And what has your experience of social housing been like?
My experience has been awful. I mean, I grew up in a low-rise tower block, and I grew up in cramped conditions. I grew up sharing a bed with two of my sisters, with my two brothers sharing a bed in the same room. So we're very cramped. We lived in damp conditions. I have a sister who has asthma. It was awful, bidding for years and years, and only after a while could we move.
Can I just
bring in Kate McIntosh really quickly, because you're an architect who started your career with a very great vision in the 60s for good quality social housing that wasn't supposed to be the experience of people like Ilhan.
I'd like to remind everybody that Britain is the 5th richest country in the world. I think it's totally disgusting that with the withdrawal and reduction in the assistance for rents, which is money which is all being moved from the public sector to the private sector, that it's predicted that 300,000 children will be evicted across this country. In other countries, they have a different priority. They realise that the future of their country and the standing of their nation depends on the next generation. In Norway, they have a ministry for housing, and all policies which are proposed have to be passed by this Ministry for Housing as to what the effects on children will be. The fact that rough sleepers, for instance, the number of rough sleepers has virtually doubled in 6 years.
I mean, Emma Dent Code, you know, Labour's record on building housing was pretty poor too.
Well, I agree with you, actually, but it has to be said that if they'd started building at that point when all the houses, you know, before the decent homes, if they'd started building and left their homes completely unrefurbished and not renovated, people would have complained about that. So I agree that they should have started building much sooner, but the amount of money they put into decent homes made a lot of people's lives much better for the quality of life. But I want to pick up on something that Tony said, if I may, about Section 106 payments. In this borough, and a lot of people have been doing research on it over the last few weeks, but I've been keeping an eye on this for many, many years. In this borough, they do not use Section 106 funds to build homes for social rent. So they use it to refurbish and to do a twiddle here and to put some homes in a garage, but they are not building homes for social rent with that money. And they should have to. They should have to.
There is a real issue, isn't there, about developers promising social housing, affordable homes, and then going back on that promise right at the last minute. That is an issue, isn't it?
Well, the market has to be able to work, and if the market works by actually making sure that we sell as many houses as possible, then you'll get more social housing built. If you just have a centralised plan system, you won't build anything.
The market totally doesn't work.
£3 billion in London, Mr. Khan's got the money to build.
Has never built the amount of housing that we need.
The GLA is committed to build housing.
The private sector has built about the same amount of housing every year since since the Second World War. It hasn't changed.
It's gone up and down, actually.
Well, roughly about 150,000 homes a year. Hasn't really changed. What has changed is we're no longer building any public housing and hardly any housing association housing. I just, very quick point, I wanted you ask what will happen to you when you graduate from Leeds. And I wanted to just pick up on what we were discussing. Westminster Council's policy, I'm afraid, is that for people in social housing who are not in priority need, the policy is to actually send them to other cities. That is now the council's official policy.
That is a myth, actually. We're not sending lots of people anywhere else.
We've got to prioritise that's in the
people,
planning document.
Things are in documents, whether they actually happen or not.
They are happening.
I mean, they're going to Margate. I mean, I worked with Citizens Advice for over 12 years with people who are homeless and sending temporary accommodation in Birmingham, Margate, Moorgate, and different places.
Well, that's Labour authorities. That's Labour authorities as well as Conservative authorities.
The question is that right? Is it, in your view, right that an area like this could say, you know, property's too expensive, you know, we can house you in social housing, but you have to move? Is that just fact? Is that just how life should work?
Well, it's up to every single council to make the priorities effectively, but what we need to do is build more homes. We can all agree, if we build more homes, we'll make the problem less. If we don't build more homes, it's going to get worse.
It doesn't work like that.
I have a solution. I mean, you can regulate the private rented sector. If you don't build enough, regulate the private rented sector so people have a choice.
More regulation equals less jobs and less homes.
Well, I think not true. In Germany, they only allow the increase of rent in line with inflation, and they insist that the minimum tenancy must be for at least 3 years, so that in consequence, the amount of public money which goes to subsidise the private sector in Germany is virtually flatlining, whereas in this country...
And so's housing inflation.
Well,
it just hasn't gone up.
Well, I think there's an issue. We're talking about not building enough houses, and actually that's half the issue. Yes, there are not enough houses, but there's also a massive issue with how people in social housing are now perceived.
Yes.
You know, you know, it's been said before that residents of the Lancaster West estate, I grew up on that estate, where they would feel they've been treated like second-class citizens. But also, there are people who do own their own houses, who are referred to as the middle, and they are squeezed. And what's being said to them is, the reason you cannot afford to live in these areas is because the people who are in social housing, or the people who are poorer than you, or less socially economically well off as you, are in these places. So it creates a whole divide, and it makes people fight amongst themselves because over space that actually is for everyone.
I mean, would you pay more tax for more houses to be built?
Yes,
absolutely.
yes.
Well, we should
If it
have a
actually
land
went on
value
housing.
tax for starters.
But some people should pay tax. Some people don't pay tax at all. Those people should pay tax. I'd happily pay more.
And what about the land value tax? Why do you think that would be? Well, I mean, the planning system was designed with a land value tax built in it. Lots of European countries have it. They even have it in America, Australia, Hong Kong. You know, not exactly bastions of socialism. It's a way of damping down this out-of-control speculative casino market. That's why we've got this housing crisis, because the market is totally dysfunctional. So market answers can never be the solution. Now, in Cardiff, I understand, they have suspended the right to buy. Isn't that one way of making sure that the stock remains as buoyant as possible?
We've done that in Scotland and in Wales, and I wouldn't support that because the public want the right to buy. That's why Mrs Thatcher won all those elections. It's that simple.
So
you can't keep telling the public.
Well,
can't tell them. I don't believe
of those right-to-buy properties are now owned by private landlords, professional private landlords who rent them out at 3 and 4 times the price.
And lots of people from low incomes got onto the housing ladder because of that. It's very good for middle-class property people in London to say that, but the reality is people got on the market for the first time. People I know from working-class backgrounds.
That perhaps wasn't a bad thing.
What percentage of people from working-class backgrounds?
Except that the terms under which Right to Buy was launched prevented the local authorities from using the capital receipts for building more housing. And even if they had been allowed to do it, because of the public subsidy that went into allowing Right to Buy, they wouldn't have been able to buy build like for like. And I disagree with you on the situation in Scotland. In Scotland, they have built in the last 10 years as much social housing as the whole of the rest of UK put together. And the average Scot now has more disposable income than the average throughout the rest of UK, precisely because the cost of housing as a proportion of income is much lower.
Can I bring this back to, we stand in the shadow of Grenfell Tower. I've asked this of you. What do you think, as a resident, this should change as of now?
Well, for starters, making sure that the people that live in these sort of places, their voices being heard. People that lived in Grenfell Tower, this wasn't a tragedy. This was crime. This could have been prevented a long time ago. People were asking for so many safety precautions being brought, but this is just a reflection on the way that our society treats poor people. And they say things like, you know, people don't work enough. My mum, for example, she works, and I've never seen anyone work harder than she does. Does she deserve to die in a fire? We lived in a tower block ourselves. That could have been us.
So attitude change is fundamental.
Attitude change is more affordable housing. I mean, to buy houses, you have to be earning about £77,000.
But I mean,
something of society earns that much.
Ilhan, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm sorry we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much. That's it from here. Tomorrow night we'll get the view from the north in Salford in Greater Manchester as we explore the issues around gentrification, community and refurbishment of old estates.